NRA TV with Bill Whittle.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Hot Mike. Hot Mike is having some minor brain surgery. We expect him back tomorrow. Until then, I'm Bill Whittle sitting in for him here from Los Angeles. And as usual, there's an entire slew of things that are appalling, interesting, disgusting, depending on how far out in the weeds we want to go today. So let's start with some more of this overall rhetoric, because it shows basically about media bias and some of the cultural bias as well. As we all know, Representative Scalise was shot last week, and we are now in a headlong rush to see who can accuse the other side the fastest and the most loudly about who should be saying what to whom and when we should be saying it. However, it did sound for a moment like we were getting a voice of actual, civility when we heard MSNBC's host Joy Reid calling for a new kind of a civility and kind of improving the tone of the national debate. So why don't we start there?
A little bit.
The tone really matters, and the word tone was used a lot this morning, and sometimes we feel like we're sort of victims of the tone.
We can set a tone to tell the nation we should disagree on things, but we don't ever do this.
I'm going to say that I think the tone does need to change.
We've all been reminded in a really horrible way about the necessity to maintain the right tone here.
Bring the tone of the rhetoric down.
Tone down the rhetoric.
Tone it down.
Tone it down. Welcome back to AM Joy. In a rare display of bipartisan agreement in Washington, Democrats and Republicans coalesced around one talking point after the Wednesday shooting at a GOP congressional baseball practice. It's time for a tonal shift in our politics. But shortly after the shooting, Republican Representative Chris Collins struck a different note from the Kumbaya chorus by placing the blame squarely on the other side of the aisle.
I always try to look for a silver lining in any tragedy like this. I can only hope that the Democrats do tone down the rhetoric. The rhetoric has been outrageous of the finger pointing, the just the tone and the angst and the anger directed at Donald Trump, his supporters. Really, then, some people react to things like that. They get angry as well.
Well, you could certainly hear how outraged and violent and divisive and how absolutely lack of respectful that little tweet clip was, rather. So I don't really understand, Joy. You do a segment where you talk about improving the tone, and then you show a bunch of politicians saying we should improve the tone, and then you say we should improve the tone, and then you say, but the Republicans started it with this statement, which sounds as civil as anything I've ever heard. He's talking about the tone, just like everything else that you played just prior to this clip. Not sure that's really the strongest point I've ever heard. But, of course, we know what's really going on behind the scenes, because just a few moments later, we got to hear the same host say this.
Timeline. And it's a delicate thing because, obviously everybody is wishing the congressman well and hoping that he recovers.
Sure.
But Steve Scalise has a history that we've all been forced to sort of ignore on race. He did come to leadership after some controversy over attending a white nationalist event, which he says he didn't know what it was. He also co-sponsored a bill to amend the Constitution to define marriages between a man and a woman. He voted for the House health care bill, which, as you said, would gut health care for millions of people, including 3 million children, and he co-sponsored a bill to repeal the ban on semi-automatic weapons. Because he is in jeopardy and everyone is pulling for him, are we required in a moral sense to put that aside at the moment?
What we're required to say is we hope he recovers, and then when he recovers, there's a renewed mindset.
So let's make sure we get this straight. We get an entire lecture on civility and tone. Then we're told that the Republicans have started the fight by saying we should reduce the tone and level the tone out and moderate the tone. And then we go directly to the same host who called for a new civility, saying that while we're very sorry he's in the hospital, he is obviously a racist and a child murderer and all the other things he's accused of. She said, well, he spoke at a nationalist meeting. I don't mean to imply anything. Of course not. And he's cut health care, gutted health care for millions of children. So make up your mind. In fact, don't make up your mind. We already know how your mind is made up. This is the fig leaf that you use for this for this rhetoric, which has been going on forever. And the reason I can say this with some confidence is because I don't have to call her a racist just because I disagree with her. But they can't function. They can't speak without that. This is not just an adjective for them now. This is kind of like some kind of a fundamental vitamin or something that the progressives seem to be able to get out of life. They can't talk about anything unless it's about race. The talk about race is the most divisive thing in the nation, and it's a little hypocritical of you, Joy, to come on and talk about raising the tone, and then as soon as you're finished, make comments about what a racist and a child murderer, the guy who's fighting for his life in the hospital is. I don't really buy it. It seems just pretty flat out bull to me. And by the way, here's another tweet from the very same person, from Joy. What a lovely, joyous person she is. She tweeted, Scalise was shot by a white man with a violent background and saved by a black lesbian police officer. And yet... Okay. Listen, you have a right to say whatever you want to, Joy. You have a right to say whatever you want to, obviously. So do I, so do we all, and we're in the commentary business and we know how that works. But what you really honestly should be a little bit ashamed of is to start a segment by calling for a new civility and tone and then immediately go here and descend to these depths. I find that a little shocking. Matter of fact, I'm not the only person who finds it a little shocking. Joe Scarborough, the host of Morning Joe on MSNBC, thought it was a little bit of bad taste as well. He tweeted, let's see what he said. He said, if you're attacking Steve Scalise's voting record right now, do yourself a favor and just stop now. I can't even believe what I'm seeing. That would be from an MSNBC host who seems to have, at least from a distance, some semblance of a soul and some semblance of decency, and I believe that to be the case with Joe Scarborough. So anyway, now that Joy Reid has set the stage for the new tolerance by declaring everybody racist and child murderers, let's go ahead and have a look at some more of the stories that are out there that just represent this incredible headwind that we have to fight against in terms of the culture and the just plain raw discrimination and bias that we face pretty much every day. Now, to help us do that, we're going to bring in an expert. We're going to bring in our friend Rich Noyes from the Media Research Center. He's the research director over there. Rich, how are you? Good to see you. How have you been?
I'm doing good, Bill. How are you?
I'm doing just great, thanks. Rich, we've got all kinds of stories out there. You know what? I'm going to have to put my drink down because there's too much to cover. Let's start with this one. Because this entire thing is so endemic, it's so systematic. We talk about it every day. It comes to the point, Rich, where we start thinking, well, why are we even bothering to point them out? But if we don't point them out, then they get away with it. So let's see if we can pin some of the tails on some of these donkeys, shall we? I'm interested in this story from the ex-New York Times managing editor Jill Abramson on CNN yesterday. Here's a quote that she had. She said, I do think that both sides are not equally at fault and that there's been a lot of false equivalency at work, especially in the discussion of the past couple of days. I think that in terms of political leadership right now, that both President Trump and the congressional leadership on the Republican side are extremely divisive and that they are really benefiting from a kind of rage machine that operates in this country. Now, Rich, this is what you do for a living. You're a professional. If you had to make an estimation of which side of the aisle was the rage machine, which side do you think it might be?
Well, I mean, what's ironic about this statement, I mean, this is, I think, Jill Abramson speaks for a lot of people, the mindset inside the liberal media, which is that all the nasty stuff in recent years has come from conservatives, it's come from Donald Trump, it's come from the sources on the right. But this is a week in which a Bernie Sanders supporter and volunteer took out a gun and shot at Republicans after asking, are those Republicans out there playing on the baseball field? And then he took his shots at them. And yet they still want to talk about Republicans being the source of all the vitriol in society. You're a little tone deaf if you want to stick with your original talking points after a display like that. Now, I don't think liberals are uniquely to blame for what this one kook did. But the media, after the Gifford shooting, after other problems like this, have gone out of their way to blame conservatives and conservative rhetoric when there's violence against Democrats or sort of other violent instances. And yet here, they refuse to accept any kind of responsibility that there's anything going on their side of the street that they need to worry about. And I think this was, what Jill Abramson was trying to suggest, which was, let's make sure we remind people that Republicans are at fault. The same New York Times that she used to work for, they had an editorial just, I think, on Thursday, where they talk about Sarah Palin being linked to the Gabby Gifford shooting. They had to retract that a few hours later because no such link ever existed. It was basically a fiction put out by left-wingers to try to smear her after the Gabby Gifford shooting in 2011. And yet, they still repeated it as if it was true because that's where their mind is at.
That's right. I remember that very well. Sarah Palin had put out a nationwide map with crosshairs targeting certain political districts in terms of these are districts that we should be fighting in and we can win. There were something like 7 or 8 of them on the map. Then when Gabby Giffords got shot, we were told that Sarah Palin had basically inspired this shooting through her violent rhetoric and her unconscionable use of targets on. Turns out the guy was a lunatic, so imagine my surprise, and that this guy had had a long history of stalking Gabby Giffords. For the first couple days, though, as you said, Rich, you could just feel them. You could feel them begging God for it to be a Republican Tea Partier. When in point of fact, the Tea Party goes out and has rallies, and when they leave the park is cleaner than it was when they came in, as opposed to, Occupy Wall Street, which are scenes of rapes, murders, drug abuse, public defecation, or Black Lives Matter, which basically run around destroying cities. So I'm not entirely sure that this point about the conservatives being the source of all of this divisiveness really holds a lot of water. What do you think?
Well, it does. And I mean, in the case of Jared Loughner, who was the shooter in the Gabby Giffords case, he had, no discernible politics. He was a mentally ill person. The person who shot Congressman Scalise, James Hodgkinson, has a long list of online diatribes, letters to the editor, and activism on the Democratic side. Now, that doesn't make all Democrats responsible, but he has political views that are very well articulated on the far left side. This is a politically motivated attempted assassination by a far left person.
And we don't have to go all the way back to Gabby Gifford. We find that during the election last year, as you remember, there were a lot of fights breaking out at Trump rallies. Find out those people were paid to go there, basically by the DNC. They were paid to go and start fights at Trump rallies. And then after Donald Trump was elected, we saw these rioters in the streets smashing windows, and then somebody tries to listen to a conservative speaker at Berkeley, and they get their head knocked in with a bicycle lock for their trouble and so on. I think this is all projection, Rich. I think this is all projection of their inner feelings onto people like us who I don't see any of this on our side.
But it's also designed for the media narrative. When you sort of put those people in rallies or build the sort of violent confrontations in the street at a Trump event, it's designed to sort of coerce, or maybe you have to coerce very hard, ABC, CBS, CNN, NBC, to run story after story about the violence at the Trump rallies without really ever figuring out who's actually responsible for this violence. And that sort of was trying to create a cloud that it's a Republican problem, it's a conservative problem, when in fact, as you said, a lot of these people were plants, they're professional agitators, they're people on the left going to sow mischief.
That's right. And when you combine that with this ongoing Russia hacked the election story, it's all an effort to undermine Donald Trump and to make any Democrats who might align with a Republican bill radioactive because they helped out, Cheeto Hitler. Rich, when we come back with a couple other stories I'd like to talk to you about, if you can stick around, we'll get to a couple of other these blasts of insanity and hypocrisy. We'll be right back after the break. This is Hot Mike on NRA TV.
Coleon Noir, and inside this little black box is a new NRA TV app. With it, you can stay up to date with all of your Second Amendment news and NRA lifestyle programming on your HD TV. So download it now. Don't worry, I'll wait.
Bill Whittle's Hot Mic here on NRA TV. We were talking with our friend Rich Noyes from the Media Research Center. And Rich, there's a couple of things I'd like to talk to you about as well in terms of the coverage of not so much the civility, which we talked about in the first half, but the general coverage about guns and how this shooting has played out in terms of what some of these people are saying about guns. So I'd like to just read two quotes for you, if you don't mind. This is MSNBC's Malcolm Nance, who said, the most important thing we need to understand from this is that this is what happens when you have an over-proliferation of guns, and it is to be expected to a certain extent. Here's the thing, Malcolm. 50, 60 years ago in this country, in the 1950s, there was a much larger proliferation of guns than there are today. You could go and take a shooting class in every high school in the country. You could go down to Walmart and buy a gun. You could buy a gun at the hardware store. You could buy guns anywhere you want to. We didn't have these mass shootings. We didn't have these massacres. It seems to me that the guns have gotten more restricted, but the outbreak is higher. Rich, could you sort of put in a thumbnail for us, just in a very general way, the way the mainstream media tends to want to blame everything on the actual weapon rather than the person doing the shooting, especially in a case like this one?
Well, it's actually not as pronounced in this case as it has been in other shootings. Orlando last year, there was an incredible amount of coverage after that shooting, not about terrorism, but about guns. And there was 8 times more statements from news reporters and stories tilted from the perspective that we need liberal gun control as opposed to we need, to respect the Second Amendment or more gun education. It was extraordinary the way they tilted that. They did the same thing after Sandy Hook. This has become sort of a go-to media narrative, event after event. I mean, sometimes they don't even bother to think. It's half an hour or an hour after the news of these things first breaks, and you see journalists on Twitter already starting to get into activist mode where they sort of, whatever's going on, they don't know who it is or what the motive is, but they already have the policy solution ready, which is ban guns.
You know what? I'm gonna just drop that second quote because you said something I think is really important. I'd like to follow up with you on this, and that's the idea of reporters as activists. You mentioned the Orlando shooting, and there were all these talks about how easy it is to get a gun in Florida. What they don't mention was that an Islamic nut job went out and tried to execute homosexuals because, according to the most severe tenets of Sharia law, that's what you do. The entire motive just completely disappeared. It was absolutely not even mentioned. We see this again and again and again and again and again. So I've always maintained, Rich, that progressives, and this is to give them the biggest benefit of the doubt I possibly can, that progressives feel that there's a world out there in the future that's coming where everything's going to be perfect. And if we can tell the truth about that, great. But if we have a little truth that gets in the way, then we shouldn't report it because we don't want to block the bigger truth of this social paradise that's coming. They are activists, aren't they? They're really, the news media is becoming the audiovisual department of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, no, I think that's clearly the case if you look back over the last several years. I mean, Rahm Emanuel, who was Obama's White House chief of staff, had a line about, never let an opportunity go to waste or never let a disaster go to waste. You saw San Bernardino, the same thing. It was an ISIS-inspired terrorist attack. The first media impulse was gun control. You had the New York Daily News rampaging against the NRA in the wake of that terrorist attack, not rampaging against ISIS. They are trying to fit their policy agenda into whatever comes up. Now, after the Giffords case, it was about trying to shut conservatives down and shut down conservative speech. Now they're sort of trying to do the same thing, or at least playing defense, like don't attack liberal speech because that's not on the agenda. Let's try to find something else we can do as a policy outcome, or let's all get along and move on to where they have higher ground. I think, you can see it as they move from story to story that the media if they're not really, I don't think they're sort of colluding with Democrats so much as they're just, they're Democrats, their friends are Democrats, that's their mindset. I think they just naturally think that's the way the world should work. They just repeat it ad nauseum and believe it's true. They're living in a bubble.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. They are living in a bubble, and they want to make everything about an inanimate piece of steel, and if that's not going to work, then they want to make it about skin color, and it's actually kind of boring when you get right down to how easy it is to predict what these people are going to say. Rich, thank you so much for joining us today. You're doing tremendous work over there at the Media Research Center, and we really appreciate your insights on all these issues.
Thanks a lot for having me.
My pleasure. Yeah, that's it, folks. They're constantly talking about the guns. They're saying, well, if this, we're making such a fuss because a white Republican, see, I told you, the race and the guns, pretty much all you need to know. A white Republican was shot, and it's national news, but during the last month or whatever, 300 people have been killed by guns. And what they don't tell you is that the 300 people who were killed, or the 8 or the 9 just this last weekend, almost exclusively, when I say almost exclusively, I mean almost exclusively, are being murdered in cities controlled by Democrats for 50 years, 60, 70, 80 years. Most of them have severe gun control. Rahm Emanuel, who never lets a crisis go to waste. Well, Rahm, you have a murder crisis in Chicago. You've got strict gun control policies. You're a progressive. You're friends with Barack Obama. And your city is one of the murder capitals of the world. So maybe we don't need to be talking about banning guns. Maybe we need to be talking about banning progressives. I get the feeling that might have a better effect on the safety of the average citizen walking through the average city. So one more story before we go today. I have to tell you, when we originally covered this story, I didn't think it was going to be quite so big. But it's just keeps coming at us. And that's, of course, the story of Donald Trump being represented as Julius Caesar in the Shakespeare in the Park plays in New York City. Now, as you might know by now, the climax of that play and the climax of this particular production of the play is when Caesar is stabbed. And in this production, it's clearly Donald Trump, man with the hair and the suit, being stabbed when there's blood everywhere, and New Yorkers give him a standing ovation. Well, it turns out that we had a couple of counter-protests on this. So let's have a look at what some people have decided to do about this particular play.
Stop the normalization of political violence against the right. This is unacceptable. You cannot... Get off the stage!
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to pause. We're going to pause. Security.
This is violence.
Security, please.
You are all Goebbels! You are all Nazis like Joseph Goebbels! This is Goebbels! You are all Goebbels! You are inciting terrorists!
Well, now, I don't know how many times I've seen somebody rush up on stage and disrupt a program, but I don't think I've ever seen somebody run up on stage and disrupt a program that was disrupting a program in order to protest the prejudice against conservatives. So this, I think, is an interesting thought for us to close with. And the question becomes this: is this a road that we want to go down? I have very mixed feelings about this. I suspect most of you do too. I know that most of us, when we see something like this, when we see somebody come out of the audience, walk up on stage and start shouting during a production of Shakespeare, people like us, civilized people who respect the law, are put off by this, and we're actually quite mortified by it, and we think it's inappropriate, and we don't think it belongs there. But we have been fighting a one-sided fight for so long now, and we've been losing this cultural war so badly, it may be time for us to reassess our look at this. You know, the Marines fought a fair fight in the beginning of the war with the Japanese at Guadalcanal until the Japanese started waving white flags and gunning down Marines that came to take their surrender, at which point the rules had changed, and the rules are changing now. So the question is, do we use tactics like this? And I have to tell you, as unsettling, I almost said upsetting, but as unsettling as it is to see, I think we absolutely have to be doing these things. All of the friends that I know who are either from the progressive left or who really know these people well, conservative writers, say one thing and they say it again and again and again. They say Republican politicians, Republican voters, and the American people do not understand, and I think this is because they're just too decent. They do not understand that this is not politics for the left. This is a blood sport. This is annihilation. Their policies can't work if there's any kind of a competition. They have to silence everybody. And we think, well, we just disagree with them. No. They're out for our skins, and that's why they fight 24 hours a day. Russ never sleeps, and these people don't either. Everything is politics to them. They don't have any religion. They don't have any jobs. They don't have any hobbies. They don't have anything. They have their politics. And we had better understand that we're dealing with people who don't play by the rules and who mock us for playing by the rules. And the question we have to be asking ourselves as a country is, at what point do we say, all right, we are fighting against dishonorable opponents who are using our own decency and our rules against us, and it's time that the gloves come off and we start fighting them on our own level, on their own level rather, because if we don't, then we're going to lose. It's a lot to think about. I don't like seeing this country this divided. Nobody does. Well, that's not true. They do. They like it. They need it. The country's not a mess. What do you need progressives for? We'll be back tomorrow for another edition of Bill Whittle's Hot Mic, where sometime, I know, during the next 24 hours, more atrocities and travesties will be committed, so I'm sure we'll have a full plate for us then. Again, this is Hot Mic on NRA TV. I'm Bill Whittle. We'll see you tomorrow.